It is my great pleasure to welcome Anne-Marie Schultz to St. John's College. Professor Schultz comes to us from Baylor University, where she is a professor of philosophy. In addition to many articles on Plato, Augustine, and other program authors, she's the author of two books, 2013's Plato's Socrates as Narrator, a Philosophical Muse, and 2020's Plato's Socrates on Socrates, Socratic Self-Disclosure and the Public Practice of Philosophy, both with Lexington Books. Whenever I have encountered Professor Schultz's work at conferences, I have been struck by her ability to take Plato's Socrates on his own terms through rigorous close reading, while simultaneously making him speak to our present concerns, making him at once untimely and contemporary. Her paper tonight is entitled Socratic Philosophical Legacies, Creating Philosophers of the Future. Please join me in welcoming Professor Anne-Marie Schultz.
Well, it's delightful to be here. One of my main graduate professors at Pennsylvania State University was a graduate of the St. John's program, so I've always felt a special affinity for St. John's through the connection with him, and also many of the authors that I read and think about a lot with respect to Platonic scholarship also had some kind of affiliation with St. John's. So congratulations to all of you for choosing this as your educational pathway. So Socratic philosophical legacies, creating philosophers of the future in the midst of political strife. The future's been on my mind a lot lately. Here we are after another election where the shape, color, and landscape of our individual and collective future as a country seems, at least to many Americans, to be in somewhat of a precarious state. To others, not so much. I can't help but think, in the midst of all of this, what the role of we philosophers might be in this coming age. When I think of exactly who we philosophers are, or more specifically who the philosophers of the future might be, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche comes most readily to mind. In Beyond Good and Evil, subtitled Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future, Nietzsche writes that a new breed of philosophers is approaching. I will risk christening them with the name not lacking in dangers. For what I can guess about them, from what they allow to be guessed, since it is typical of them to want to remain riddles in some respect, these philosophers of the future might have the right, and perhaps also the wrong, to be described as those who attempt. And that's from Beyond Good and Evil, section 42. And so I might ask, those who attempt what? Those who attempt the work of philosophy in complicated situations and circumstances which may threaten to undermine the practice of philosophy itself. As it turns out, Plato, too, was interested in the future of philosophy and philosophers of the future. The most obvious way in which we can see Plato's concern with cultivating future philosophers is his creation of the academy. However, we also see Plato's interest in the future of philosophy and future philosophers throughout the dialogues as well. This future focus of Plato's work is particularly noticeable in dialogues that have narrative frames. Consider the opening of the Republic. I went down to the Piraeus with Glaucon. Not only does Plato have his character Socrates participate in a philosophical conversation about justice long into the night, and here we are still doing that, but Plato's Socrates, as a narrator, gets up the very next day and recounts the story to some unknown audience. Though we don't know any of the details about his narrative audience, nor the context in which he narrates that particular dialogue, the very act of retelling the philosophical events is significant. It shows Socrates carrying the activity of philosophy forward into the future. He creates a new philosophical community around him by telling the story of his own past philosophical practices. Plato presents this future-facing narrative practice as an integral part of Socrates' philosophical activity. Socrates narrates 5 dialogues, and I have those down on your handout under section 2, and I guess I'll just say, I kind of skipped section 1. In the Platonic dialogues, there's a basic distinction between dialogues that are called, sometimes they're called enacted or dramatic dialogues, and those are dialogues that it's just like you turn on the TV and the action's happening. There isn't any narrative mediation. And then a handful of dialogues have a narrator, and half of those are narrated by Socrates, and half of those are narrated by people other than Socrates. So anyway, Socrates narrates 5 dialogues: the Lysis, the Charmides, the Protagoras, the Republic, and the Euthydemus. In fact, if you were to accept the authenticity of the lovers, he even narrates 6. But even as a character in dialogues that he doesn't narrate, the character Socrates frequently narrates stories about his philosophical past to bring that history into conversation with his current interlocutors. Considered his recount of his engagement with the oracle's pronouncement in the Apology that no one is wiser than he, his presentation of his conversations with Diotima in the Symposium, and the autobiographical passage about Anaxagoras and the Phaedo. In this talk, I examined portions of 2 Platonic dialogues, the Phaedo and the Theatetus, and my understanding is that y'all read those, so glad to hear that. I argue that they deal either explicitly or implicitly with the complexities of preserving Socratic and other philosophical legacies in the midst of social and political turmoil. To be sure, each of these dialogues is more often associated with other important philosophical themes. The Phaedo addresses arguments for the immortality of the soul and challenges to it. The Theatetus addresses core epistemological issues, such as the nature of knowledge and justified true belief. However, at the same time, these dialogues also explore what it means to participate in a philosophical legacy or a tradition. And I would say, y'all, I would say, have special access in some ways to what that might actually mean. What does it mean to be part of an intellectual community that has a long and continuous tradition? All right, so anyway, Plato, by examining certain passages from these dialogues, we can gain insight into the ways that Plato aimed to create philosophical community in ways that would nurture philosophers as they carry the legacy of Socratic philosophical practice into the future. I end by asking what we can learn from the historical backdrop in which Plato wrote these dialogues that may help us cultivate philosophical practices in our various communities in such a way that we might safeguard intellectual freedoms in America's contemporary pedagogical and political landscapes. So that's the big picture. Someone outside asked me, what's the big takeaway? Right there. If we look at Plato, he's going to help us with our own activities of being philosophers in the world today. Before I go into the Phaedo, I guess I'll just give you, I'm going to go back to the handout that I made. So I've been interested in, I was an English major in college, and so I've been interested in language and how texts are structured for a long time. And someone taught me how to read Plato, and I realized that a lot of the things that I could do as an English major, I could apply quite readily to Plato's dialogues. And one of those was looking at the narrative structure of some of the dialogues. I've been interested in it in some way since I was y'all's age. Okay. And it's stuck with me. In some ways, it's my longest relationship outside of my family of origin is Plato. So, all right, and so and it took me a long time to write my first book, but what I looked at is those 5 dialogues that Socrates narrates, and I went through them, and I looked at all the passages where Socrates is speaking in his narrative voice. And what I mean by that would be like when he's describing Thrasymachus in the Republic, and we learn through that Thrasymachus is producing an enormous amount of sweat, right? And we learn through his narrative description that he's looking like a wild animal, like he's about to pounce on Polemachus and him. And we wouldn't know that as easily if Plato hadn't chosen to structure those dialogues as a narrative. That makes sense? And so when I looked at all of those passages and those 5 dialogues, one of the things I noticed is that Socrates pays a lot of attention in the narrative dialogues to his own emotional states, like he's very self-reflective and self-aware. And again, it's not like we can't see that in enacted dialogues, but we see it more clearly in narrative dialogues. He also is very attuned to the emotional states of his interlocutors. And so he uses the emotions in philosophically productive ways. And that challenges a fairly entrenched view of Socrates and Plato in the secondary literature that they're intellectualists, right? That they to some degree denigrate the emotions and that they put reason way above the emotions. And it's not that that's entirely wrong, but I was just wanting to complicate that picture a bit. Okay, and so I did that, and what I thought I would do next is I thought I'd look at the dialogues that have non-Socratic narrators. And those are listed for you in part 3, or part 2. Anyway, it's the Symposium, the Phaedo, the Theatetus, and the Parmenides. And as I was looking at those dialogues, I noticed that Socrates as a character is still narrating, which I mentioned before. And then I started thinking about one of the things that's kind of big in philosophy circles today is this idea of public philosophy, that philosophers should be public facing in their work, like maybe doing a podcast or writing a blog or being on the radio or something like that, right? And it's not just a classroom experience. And so I decided that really what Socrates is doing in those dialogues is practicing a kind of public philosophy. And the stories he tells, I think, are very significant because the stories he tells are about his own experiences as a student. So he's willing to share how he learned about philosophy and became the philosopher that we all know and love him as. Okay. So that ended up being its own book. And so now finally I'm on book 3. So I'm writing my own trilogy of Platonic work, maybe to rival Plato's on. And that's what I talk about in part 4 there. And so that's what I've been spending the last, well, at least a little over a decade of my life doing. And then that last part will just become relevant in the last part of the talk. So that's a bit just about me and my work. Okay, so after that public promoting aside, I'll turn back to the paper. So it's mostly about the Phaedo and a little bit about the Theatetus, so we'll go ahead and dive in. Okay. All right, the Phaedo. Plato's Phaedo offers an inspirational account of Socrates' final hours. On the day that Socrates must drink the poison hemlock, his companions foregathered at daybreak at the courtyard where the trial took place. As they pass the time of this last day together, Socrates responds to several challenging objections raised by Simmias and Cabes with respect to Socrates' apparently unwavering belief in the immortality of the soul. Even in the face of his own death and by and large, Socrates seems unafraid of whatever fate awaits him. His countenance in the face of death offers a profound model of what it means to die well. In addition to being one of Plato's most emotionally resonant dialogues, the Phaedo is also one of his most intricately crafted narrative works. It begins with an enacted conversation between Echecrates and Phaedo. Phaedo is visiting Echecrates and others in this Pythagorean enclave in the town of Phlius. And Echecrates laments that they have heard little from Athens lately. We don't actually know exactly how long it is between when Socrates died and the Phaedo, but maybe a year or two. Yeah. So it's not that immediate, but it's not a huge distance in time, probably. We learn of the events of Socrates' death through Phaedo's evocative recounting of them to this group of eager Pythagorean listeners. And I explore Phaedo's own narrative self-reflection and how he upholds the philosophical legacy of Socrates by placing himself in the story of Socrates' last days. In other work, I actually focus a lot on the Pythagorean dimension of this setting, as Pythagoras himself had a very large philosophical legacy that had a lot of influence on Plato, but I won't go into that today. I will just mention one thing that's kind of interesting about what I call the in real life Phaedo. Almost everyone who is in a Platonic dialogue actually really existed in real life. Sometimes I think of it as like the Marvel universe that Plato is creating with his own dialogues, right? But he's creating a kind of alternate reality. But these people really did exist, and we actually do know some things about them. And if you're interested in that, there's a really great book that's called The People of Plato by a woman, Deborah Nails. And she goes through and she does historical research and gives us it's really fascinating that she gathers everything we actually know about these people in real life and puts it all in one place. And it's a really great thing to read along with reading any particular dialogue you happen to come across. But anyway, one of the things she says about the real life Phaedo is that after Socrates dies, he goes on to write his own philosophical dialogues, and he also establishes a philosophical school. If so, he seems to be a remarkable Socratic success story. He practices philosophy independently of Socrates, but at the same time upholds the legacy of Socrates. So Phaedo begins his account to these eager listeners and talks about gathering in the courthouse, and then they enter the cell and they find Xanthippe, Socrates' wife, in the cell. And after a very problematic scene, to my mind, where Socrates sends her and the other women away, at least as Phaedo tells the story, those present discuss several arguments for the immortality of the soul. All, to be truthful, are philosophically problematic. They discuss a promising view, the harmony model, at length. However, just before Socrates offers his extended autobiographical account about learning from Anaxagoras and how he moves from natural philosophy to his own method, the harmony method is abandoned as well. Socrates tells Simmias, "My good friend, it is quite wrong for us to say that the soul is a harmony, and in saying so, we would disagree both with the divine poet Homer and with ourselves." Socrates distills the essence of Simmias and Cabes' concern about the fate of the soul. They worry that the soul has endured many incarnations doesn't suffice. He says it makes no difference whether it enters a body once or many times as far as the fate of each of us is concerned. If we cannot prove the soul immortal, then there is good reason to fear death. Socrates challenges Cabes. "This is what I think you maintain, Cabes, and I deliberately repeat it often in order that no point may escape us and that you may add or subtract something if you wish." And actually, Cabes affirms that he wishes to add or subtract nothing, so Socrates has got it right. And at this point in the story, and this is also another way that the narrative commentary works in the dialogues, at this juncture, Phaedo's narrative voice breaks in. He recounts this poignant moment and tells Echecrates and the others, "Socrates paused for a long time, deep in thought. After this long silence, Socrates continues, 'This is no unimportant problem that you raise, Cabes, for it requires a thorough investigation into the cause of generation and destruction.' At this operatic impasse, Socrates then offers his autobiographical account. 'I will, if you wish, give you an account of my experiences in these matters.' Socrates begins, 'When I was a young man, like y'all, I was wonderfully keen on that wisdom which they call natural science, for I thought it splendid to know the causes of everything, why it comes to be, why it perishes, and why it exists at all.' Socrates presents himself as being concerned with generation and destruction of all things, the soul included. As he tells this story, he emphasizes his own thought processes. For example, he remarks, 'I was often changing my mind in the investigation,' and reports that, 'This is what I thought of them then, I thought my opinion was satisfactory, and then I changed my mind.' Socrates then relates the next stage of his journey. He says, 'Then, as I investigated how these things perish and what happens to the things in the sky and on earth, finally I became convinced that I have no natural aptitude at all for this type of investigation.' So he might not elect your science lab things so much. Who knows? 'And of this I will give you sufficient proof.' Socrates emphasizes the depth of his ignorance. 'This investigation made me quite blind to those things which I and others thought that I clearly knew before, so that I unlearned what I thought I knew before about many other things, and specifically about how men grew.' And then Socrates asks Cabes, 'Do you not think this was reasonable?' Socrates draws Cabes into the story with these questions, and I suggest that he does so because he wants Cabes to feel his confidence in natural philosophy, but then his despair of aporia that follows, and finally the solace in the solution that Socrates eventually adopts. Socrates' strategy seems to work. Cabes asks him his current thoughts on these matters, and Socrates responds, 'That I am far, by Zeus, from believing that I know the causes of any of those things.' He discusses his rejections of units and measures, addition, subtraction, and emphasizes, 'Nor can I any longer be persuaded by division, because the cause of becoming two is not the cause of everything.' He summarizes the effect of his engagement with natural philosophy. 'I do not any longer persuade myself that I know why a unit or anything else comes to be or perishes or exists by the old method of investigation, and I do not accept it.' Socrates now describes how he develops a confused method of his own. He says, "One day I heard someone reading," as he said, and that's a little Phaedo's reference, Phaedo breaking in there a little bit too, "from a book of Anaxagoras, saying that it is mind that directs everything and is the cause of everything. I was delighted with this cause, and it seemed to be good in a way that mind should be the cause of everything." The narrative context of this book is quite interesting. Socrates learns it is from Anaxagoras because the person reading the book out loud, ostensibly in the Agora, said it was. And Socrates cares enough to preserve not only the detail of how he came to have this knowledge, but also a small detail of what the person who was reading it said in addition to simply reading the book. The hearing transmission of oral culture also links us back to the beginning of dialogue, where there are numerous references to hearing, which are important to the Pythagorean tradition. And I also think it's worthwhile noting that there are numerous references to his emotional engagement with this learning. He's delighted, it pleases him greatly, and it seems to him to be good. Socrates includes his own assessment of the knowledge in the story he recounts, embracing the autobiographical aspects of his story. He also emphasizes that this sort of learning is more oriented toward understanding the human being specifically, and not human as part of some overall part of the coming and being and passing away of all things. He believed, though wrongly, that Anaxagoras' emphasis on mind referred to something quintessentially human. On these premises, then, that it befitted human being to investigate only about this and other things what is best. The same person must inevitably also know what is worse, for that is part of the same knowledge. Socrates continues to include his own reflections about what he was learning in the account he said. He says, "As I reflected on this subject, I was glad to think I had found in Anaxagoras," I love this translation of it, "a teacher about the cause of things, a teacher after my own heart." Here, too, notice the emotional characterization of his thought processes and his learning. He presents himself in a hypothetical teacher-student relationship with Anaxagoras, much like he does with Diotima in the Symposium. He presents himself as an eager learner. He thought that he would tell me first whether Earth is flat or round, and then he would explain why so, saying which is better, and it was better for those to be so. If he showed me those things, I should be prepared never to desire any other kind of cause. Simply put, Socrates assumed that Anaxagoras had an ethical or a teleological dimension to his teaching. And under that view, Socrates was quote, ready to find out about all the material dimensions of the universe and how all the parts interacted with each other, precisely because he believed that Anaxagoras cared about what was better and worse, and not just that things are or are not. He explains, "I never thought that Anaxagoras, who said that those things were directed by mind, would bring in any other cause for them, and it was best for them to be as they were." And so he's really excited, and he says, "I would not exchange my hopes for a great fortune." And I eagerly acquired his books and read them as quickly as I could in order to know the best and the worst possible. I think it's also important to note that Socrates takes charge of the ownership, we might say in our own language today, of his own learning process. He reads. He does not merely listen to someone else reading. In fact, he eagerly acquires the books as quickly as possible. And there's a lot of emotionality here as well. He's eager. He, like Augustine centuries later, is on fire to know. He offers a very emotional accounting of his learning process, and he eloquently desires his desire for a teacher. I would gladly become the disciple of any person who taught the workings of that kind of cause. However, there was no one to be found. At this juncture precisely, he turns to ask Cabes if he would like to know what Socrates did in the absence of just such a teacher. The parallels of their position are abundantly apparent. Socrates could not find the teacher that he desired. Cabes is worried how he will exist without the teacher he has found. Socrates asks Cabes if he wants to know what Socrates did in the absence of such a teacher. "Since I was deprived and neither could discover it myself or learn it from another, do you wish me to give you an explanation how, as a second best, I busied myself with the search for causes?" And I left this, actually it's coming up. He says, "I would wish it above all else," Cabes says, and Socrates complies. I love this passage too. "When I had wearied of the investigation of things, I thought that I must be careful to avoid the experience of those who watch an eclipse of the sun. For some of them ruin their eyes unless they watch its reflection in water or some such material. A similar thought crossed my mind, and I feared that my soul would be altogether blinded if I looked at things with my eyes and tried to grasp them with each of my senses. So I thought I must take refuge in discussion and investigate the truth of things by the means of words. Socrates continues to emphasize his thought process with emotional and physical language. He's weary, he fears, he takes refuge. In all, he presents his turn to the philosophy of words as an attempt to find philosophical safety after swimming in the dangerous waters of physical investigation. It appears that he's turning away from sense experience altogether, except that the language that he uses to describe this turn is so filled with physical description. Socrates also makes clear that the analogy he is using is inadequate. For I certainly do not admit that the one who investigates things by means of words is dealing with images any more than one who looks at facts. Unfortunately, the books of Anaxagoras disappoint Socrates. He laments this wonderful hope, the hope that he thought that he had found an ethical cause, was dashed as he went on reading and saw that the man made no use of mind, nor gave it any responsibility for the management of things. Socrates goes on to explain his discovery that Anaxagoras was no different than any other of his pre-Socratic material forefathers. Socrates suggests that it is precisely this lack of interest in ethical grounding that is the cause of so much disagreement of causes and principles. They do not believe that the truly good and the binding binds and holds them together. Socrates now elaborates the confused method of his own. He explained, I started in this manner, taking as my hypothesis in each case the theory that seemed to be most compelling. I would consider it as true about causes and everything else, whatever we agreed as untrue and what we did not do so disagreed. He outlines the manner by which he became his own teacher, for he was no longer dependent on the theories of others to guide his inquiry, but the theory that to him seemed the best. In a word, he becomes his own trusted guide. And as he articulates this turn, it is also clear that he is a teacher for others, for he recognizes that his avid pupil, Cabes, has no idea what he's talking about. Much like Diotima addressed him long ago, Socrates turns to Cabes and says, but I want you to put my meaning more clearly, for I think you do not understand me now. And Cabes affirms that he does not. And Socrates continues, this is what I mean. It is nothing new, but what I have never stopped talking about, both elsewhere and in the earlier part of our conversation. I'm going to try and show you the kind of cause that I have concerned myself. I assume the existence of a beautiful, itself by itself, of a good and a great, and all of the rest. And if you grant me these and agree that they exist, I hope to show you that the cause as a result is to find the soul to be immortal. Socrates makes clear that these are his assumptions, his action of assuming, his action of turning toward these things which he is concerned with. It's a self-motivated inquiry rather than waiting for someone else to give him the answer that will ultimately provide the proof of immortality. He then asks Cabes of something in return. He simulates Cabes' own activity of taking ownership of the philosophical process. Cabes must stop waiting for proofs to be given to him. He must become actively involved in the proof of immortality of the soul that he so desperately wishes to believe. Cabes is actually a bit qualified in his response. He says, take it that I grant you this and hasten to your conclusion. He still sees this process as something that belongs to Socrates. He has not taken the process to be his own. Socrates' own account more or less ends here, and the next pages of the dialogue are Socrates' interrogation with Cabes about what he really believes with respect to the forms. Throughout, Socrates is trying to get Cabes to take ownership of his own beliefs, but a thorough examination of all these lies beyond the scope of what I'm doing here. I'll just say, in my view, Socrates' autobiographical account meets with limited success. He does not persuade them completely. He concludes, therefore, the soul, Cabes, is most certainly deathless and indestructible, and our souls will really dwell in the underworld. But Cabes does not quite say he believes it, but rather, I have nothing more to say against that, Socrates, nor can I doubt your arguments. Cabes suggests that Simmias might have still more to say, which indicates that he too is not completely convinced. And Simmias admits that he has private misgivings. Socrates encourages them to analyze the arguments adequately, and if the conclusion is clear, they should look no farther. In my view, to use Aristotle's language, Socrates is suggesting that they not demand more precision than the subject matter allows, but rather they should cultivate their own resources for the journey ahead and not let the desire for proof undermine the value of belief. After the autobiographical account, Socrates tells another story about the guides and the journey to the region of the earth. His autobiographical account guides them to a place where they can accept possibly a mythic explanation of what awaits them at the end. The autobiography begins where the argument ends, the myth begins where the autobiography ends. And perhaps there is somehow a model of understanding immortality of the soul that can be found here, along with an increased understanding of the importance of philosophical legacy. Socrates' narrative about Anaxagoras speaks to their immediate challenge, to learn to live and philosophize without their own beloved guide. Socrates tells them how he became prepared to philosophize on his own so that they might have a model about how to philosophize on their own. Phaedo imitates and therefore initiates the process of philosophizing on his own by telling his story as a means for caring for the community in Phlius and helping for them care for one another. I'll leave out the part about the Pythagoreans. So what do Phaedo's words and deeds indicate to us about a post-Socratic philosophical community? As scholar Pierre Hadot says, the real problem for Socrates is therefore not the problem of knowing this or knowing that, but of being in this way or that way. The same problem confronts the students of Socrates in the absence of Socrates. As a way of finding a life beyond Socrates, they should take Socrates' cautions about misology and misanthropy to heart. As Socrates explains the danger of argument, hatred of argument, he links the continuation of the practice of philosophy with their continued existence and with his death. He tells them, "We must take courage and be eager to attain soundness, you and the others for the sake of your whole life for still to come, and I for the sake of death itself." And then there's this really telling passage where Socrates actually tells them, "I am in danger at this moment of not having a philosophical attitude about this." And he asks them their help in continuing the argument and the legacy forward. Later, Socrates also tells them that they must comfort one another. They must use these arguments as incantations to quell the disquiet in their souls. On this point, Christopher Long notes that Socrates here turns to the attention of those present to the community gathered, implicitly encourage them to become singers themselves and to care for the community once he is no longer with them. Differently put, they must learn to see the practice of philosophy as a means by which they can support one another. They are not good yet at providing this care to each other. Phaedo tells Echecrates, "So we stayed, talking amongst ourselves, questioning what had been said, and then again talking of the great misfortune that had befallen us. We all had felt like we had lost a father and would be orphaned the rest of our lives. However, all is not lost. At least they are talking together and questioning each other, though that may not fully realize the benefits of their communal engagement, they are yet nonetheless in community with each other." The lamenting continues. Apollodorus, Phaedo, Crito, everyone breaks down in tears, and Socrates exhorts them to change their behavior. He tells them that's why, he threw the women out, because he didn't want to deal with this over-emotionality. Phaedo reports that his words made us ashamed, and we checked our tears. However, the fact that Phaedo tells the story to the Phlians conveys a sense of hopefulness that he might meet Socrates' philosophical expectations. He does not just tell the story of Socrates, but he tells the story of himself and Socrates. In doing so, he makes Socrates' story his own. In doing so, I would say he abides in true virtue by caring for the legacy of Socrates. I think we can use that as a model as we continue our own philosophical practices, crafting our own philosophical narratives and sharing them with our students and others close to us. I think it is our responsibility as philosophers of the future to uphold the Socratic legacy of philosophical freedom within the complexities of our contemporary age. Okay, so that's the Phaedo, and the Theatetus part is not quite as long. Okay, the Theatetus is a fascinating dialogue with respect to the narrative frame. There's some evidence, both internal to the text and in terms of stylometric analysis, that suggest a strong connection with other Socratically narrated dialogues. For whatever reason, though, Plato chose to revise it into its current narrative form, where you could say Euclides is the narrator. In what follows, I briefly suggest that an interest in philosophical legacy and post-Socratic philosophical community may be the reason. Some suggest that the initial framing conversation between Euclides and Terpsion takes place in 369 BC, which would allow for a timeline of, in real life, Theatetus to be involved in the mathematical advances of the academy. If so, this temporal distance is quite long, longer even than the distance in the Parmenides frame with its events. And I think there's something that's kind of compelling about this reason with respect to what I'm interested in, that this temporal distance would emphasize the importance of Socrates' philosophy for several decades after Socrates' death. However, there are a lot of reasons that I'm not completely persuaded by that, and Deborah Nails' assessment is that 391 is a more likely dating of the conversations of the Theaetetus, and so that would only be 8 years after Socrates' death, but it's still a long time. There are a lot of reasons that she gives for that, but I'll just mention one, that there's apparently a tradition that Plato visited Euclides in Megara several times after the death of Socrates. Yeah. Leaving all that aside, there are strong links between the Phaedo and the Theaetetus. Euclides and Terpsion were both listed as present at Socrates' death, and we also learned that Euclides constructed his book about the conversation between Socrates and Theaetetus between his visits to Socrates in Athens as Socrates is awaiting his trial and death. Thus, Euclides does not explicitly say so. It seems likely that Euclides was visiting Socrates while he was in prison. Euclides tells us that the conversations took place not long before his death. A point further confirmed at the end of the dialogue when Socrates remarks that he's off to receive his indictment. Euclides makes some notes of the original conversational report from Socrates, and then he says, as soon as I got home, and then after he would write them down, and then afterwards he would recall it at his leisure, write it out again, and then whenever he went to Athens, he would ask Socrates about the points he couldn't remember and corrected his version when he got home. You know, it's interesting to think about. I mean, I think Socrates' prison cell was a pretty busy place, right? I mean, you've got him talking to Phaedo and hearing, about his dream. Crito's kind of there stalking him, watching him sleep and stuff. You've got Euclides coming in. You've got Xanthippe visiting him. You've got him having conversations with the guard. It's really clear that Socrates really doesn't stop philosophizing, right? He even seems to amp it up in some ways in the flurry of activity in his final days. A lot of the dialogues, Theaetetus, Euthyphros, Sophist, Statesman, a missing philosopher dialogue, unless the philosopher is meant to be taken as the apologies, which some people think. You can add all these visits with Euclides and Crito, culminating in the Phaedo. And so he seems intent on the importance of forming philosophical community and connection with his friends up until his very last breath. Like Phaedo, Euclides in real life wrote Platonic dialogues and established a school, the modern school of philosophy that emphasized logic, and it lasted for quite some time. So Euclides himself, like Phaedo, goes on to found philosophical community. And then within the dialogue, there's also the philosophical community between Euclides himself, Terpsion, and also the slave that's reading the text to them. And I think the presence of the slave is significant for several reasons. Okay? The slave reads and facilitates their own philosophical leisure. Okay? But as a reader, the slave is in fact an active participant in facilitating the philosophical conversation. The community is formed by the three of them around a text about Socrates. And so that is perhaps a model for what future Socratic legacy communities are meant to do. And I think also the slave is included suggests the possibility of opening a philosophical communities to others who are outside of the inner circle of philosophy. It reminds me a lot, actually, of the presence of the prison guard who has philosophical conversations with Socrates in the Phaedo that Socrates refers to. I also think it raises a question of Plato's own possible critique of slavery, and slavery was ubiquitous in the Athenian world, and so I think that's another important thing to think about and that we might think about as we're navigating our own social turmoil today. Okay, so that's a little bit about the Theatetus. There's more I could say, but I want to keep it at an hour. Okay, so last part is about the historical context in which Plato is writing in. Okay, so creating philosophers of the future in the middle of political strife. Plato's philosophy is often associated with that famous image of him pointing a finger up to the sky in Raphael's famous School of Athens. As lovely as the School of Athens is as a work of art, I think it conveys a misleading image of the natures of Plato's own philosophical art. While Raphael's Aristotle is pointing downward toward concrete reality, it is actually Plato who wrote dialogues about real people, like Socrates, who are deeply involved in the social and political realities of their day. In many ways, Plato's Athens, the Athens of the post-plague, post-Peloponnesian War, and post-reconciliation agreement, is not unlike our own. We live in a time of intense political turmoil in a world now shaped by a pandemic. Uh, First, I just will mention to you a little bit about the plague that hit Athens. It arrived in 430 BCE, kind of right at the beginnings of the Peloponnesian War. It probably originated in Ethiopia and spread across the Mediterranean. And at the time, Athens was extremely overcrowded because so many people had sought the protection of the city because of the Spartan advances into the outlying areas of the country. Um, and one scholar, Littman, notes that most of the population was infected, and perhaps as many as 25% of the city's population dies. Also, like our own plague, it came in waves. It broke in May 30 BC, 433 C, summer of 428, winter of 427, and overall it lasted 4.5 to 5 years. So we may still have a little time to go in navigating our own pandemic experience. The experience of the plague and the subsequent loss of moral norms and behaviors certainly shaped the philosophical views of both Socrates and Plato. The historian Thucydides, who himself contracted the plague and survived, who was their contemporary, wrote about the social effects of the plague in great detail. Here are some things he wrote about it. He explained that the catastrophe was so overwhelming that men, not knowing what would happen next to them, became indifferent to every rule of religion or law. He elaborates, since the disease struck without regard to a person's piety toward the gods, people felt abandoned by the gods and that there seemed to be no benefit in worshiping them. The plague had economic benefits, not benefits, effects as well. Thucydides says people started spending money indiscriminately. Many felt that they would not live long enough to enjoy the fruits of wise investment. While some of the poor unexpectedly became wealthy by inheriting the property of their relatives, it is also recorded that people refused to behave honorably because most did not expect to live long enough to enjoy a good reputation for it. Overall, Thucydides paints a gruesome portrait of the devastation. He says the dead were heaped on top of each other, left to rot, or shoved into mass graves. Sometimes those carrying the dead would come across an already burning funeral pyre and just simply dump the new body on it and walk away. Others appropriated prepared pyres so as to have enough fuel to cremate their own dead. Those lucky enough to survive the plague developed an immunity and so became the main caretakers of those who later fell ill. I'll also mention that Plato and Socrates are no strangers to political turmoil either. Both fought in the Peloponnesian War, Socrates at the beginning of the battle and retreat from Delium, as he talks about in both the Charmides and the Symposium. And Plato fought in the ending years of the war when it was clear that Athens was going to lose. The war ended in 404 BCE. The terms of the surrender for the Athenians were harsh. They had to dismantle their long protective walls, burn almost all of their ships, and they relinquished their self-governance. Okay. Um, and what happened, I'll just summarize, and many of you probably know this, is that there are many people in Athens who are very sympathetic to Sparta, and so Sparta put them in charge, and their group was called the 30. And they were really heinous group of people in terms of how they acted. They sent many of the citizens into exile with the enemies. They unjustly put many people to death and deprived them of burial. Many who had full civic rights they excluded from citizenship, and the daughters of many they debarred from intending marriage. A group of Athenian Democrats, backed by the Spartan enemies from abroad, fought them, and democracy was restored in 403 BC. And so that's only, 4 years before Socrates' trial in 399 BC. That's an election cycle. So everyone present at Socrates' trial would be very much aware of the end of the war, that they lost, and that they lost self-governance self-governance and their democracy for a year. And there's several instances I'll just mention in the Apology where Socrates actually refers to this historical context, and then people will start, you can imagine he'll say, gentlemen, don't make a disturbance. And so you have to imagine them like being upset. And so why are the jurors responding in such emotional terms to Socrates' contextualization of the story? And I think the references to the exile under the 30, his references to Chaerephon's death, provide us with two clues. Barry Strauss explains that when the 30 began killing pro-democratic citizens, those who survived financed an anti-oligarchic movement in the mountains outside of Athens, and then they grew into the army, and then they finally defeated them in a battle. The battle is called, it's down on your list, the Battle of Mucinea. And actually, there's a very Plato scholar that I'm good friends with named Jake Howland, and he's recently written a book called Glaucon's Fate. And he actually suggests that Glaucon actually died fighting with the 30 in this particular battle. And that hill is actually, they would have been, when in the beginning of the Republic, when Socrates and Glaucon are going back up to Athens, they would have passed right by the hill that in real life Glaucon is later going to die on. So it really makes the Republic very dark. Okay? So, Glaucon doesn't get it at all. Not only does he not get it, he becomes a tyrant and dies because of his tyrannical inclinations, right? But anyway, the good news is the Democrats do win, but it's just a good example of all that was going on. Yeah. And I'll just end by saying one more thing. And so what I find, I guess, helpful about this background is there were half the people in Athens were pro-Spartan, and half the people in Athens weren't. Nonetheless, after this battle where they were fighting each other, killing each other, taking each other's property, it was a mess. Okay? They did manage to come back together as a city. And so how can that be? How did they actually manage to do that? And one of the ways that they did is that they had what is called the reconciliation agreement. Okay? And each side set aside their differences and reconciled. They agreed to hold no grievance against each other with respect to public crimes that had occurred during the rule of the 30. Okay? They also had a renewed emphasis on the importance of written law. Okay? So the process of Mark Bunn, who's a really great ancient historian, the process authorizing the nomoi of Athens really helped the demos get back on its feet, and it was a way of preserving the essential time-tested practices of Athens against the possibility of future subversion. Yeah, you can think of all kinds of parallels that are going on today. Third, there were numerous jury trials about the harm that the citizens inflicted on one another because personal crimes were not covered by the amnesty oath. So that's a little blip on their radar screen there. But they did manage to come back together. And also the final thing that some scholars mention is that there seems to be a mutual recognition that there really were people of what they call natural nobility, agathoi, on both sides of the divide. And so those are kind of the solutions of not holding people accountable for public crimes, importance of written law, this recognition of natural nobility. And so you might ask yourself, in what ways might those things work in our contemporary democracy today? And I think, for me, the importance of written law is probably the one that we can really hold on to, maybe. But at the very least, as we confront the divisive discord of our own political landscape, current threats to democracy, we would do well, I think, to hold fast to the possibility of recovering from divisive factional harm that we are experiencing today. And so that's what I think, if I want to say the takeaway of what I think we can learn about Plato and learning about his background is that he becomes all the more relevant as a model for what we can do when we practice philosophy out there in our own political worlds. So that's what I got.